Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today, or good afternoon or good evening to anyone joining from different time zones. I know we have a few. It's really wonderful to see lots of familiar names on the participant list today, and also some people we don't know at all yet. You're all very welcome. My name is Lorna Denison. I'm a director at MHM and I lead our US division. I'm joining you today from our Astoria office in New York. My pronouns are she and her. I also have my colleague Laura on joining us. I'm going to ask her to introduce herself now too.
Hi, I'm Laura Carbon. I'm a senior researcher at MHM. I'm joining you from Liverpool in the UK today, and my pronouns are she and her.
I also have my colleague Charlene and a special guest joining us later on today, and we'll ask them to introduce themselves at the time. And as Laura said, we'd love you to introduce yourself, so please do use the chat to say hello, who you are, where you're from. The purpose of today is to share some data from our recent study into the New York market. We'll be taking you through our findings for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after that. So please do add any questions as they come up to the Q&A feature, so you don't forget them at the time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end. So quickly, for anyone who doesn't know us yet, I'm going to give you MHM's 10-second elevator pitch. So Morris Hargreaves McIntyre is an international consultancy. We work with cultural, heritage, and non-profit organizations of all sizes around the world. What really binds us all together as a team is that we are fascinated by what makes people tick. We want to understand people and what drives them. We believe in the intelligence of the audience and that the best way to find out what the audience is thinking is to just ask them. And we believe in using evidence and insight to drive decision making. So we conduct audience and market research, supporter strategy, brand and strategic planning, program and exhibition testing and evaluation, lots of kinds of work helping our clients listen to the voice of the audience so that they can use our work to connect more people more deeply with their causes and reach their goals. We've titled this session, What's Next for New York Audiences, because today we wanted to look ahead and feel a little bit more optimistic than we maybe have in the last 18 months. I should say we do know, however, we have quite a few participants joining us today who are not based in the New York area. Not to worry, I do think you're going to find a lot of relevant information that is not necessarily just New York specific. We have some insights that we do feel are more universal. Before we dig into the data, I wanted to clarify what we actually did for this study and where it came from. It's what we call an audience atlas, which basically means a kind of comprehensive picture of the market. Using a trusted panel partner, we sampled 2,500 adults in the New York metropolitan area. The survey took place in June this year, so it is a few months old now, but it was at that point where it felt like we were starting to come out the other side of this and reopening venues was either happening already or on the cards. We set quotas and used weighting to ensure that our sample was demographically representative of the overall population by age, by gender, educational attainment, and race or ethnicity group. So for example, the latest census data said that around 16% of the New York metro area adult population identify as Black or African American. So we made sure that 16% of our sample also identified this way. And the other thing that's important to us was that it covers the whole market, not just those who have been or engaged with culture before frequently. We wanted to include those who might not already be on your mailing lists. We'll also look at this data through a psychographic lens using culture segments, which I know many of you will be familiar with and some might not be. Culture segments is our segmentation system based on what people gain from cultural experiences. We'll give more of an intro to that later. And finally, before we get to the data, we wanted to also take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to the New York Philharmonic who partnered with us for this study and were an absolute joy to work with. I know we have a couple from the team on the webinar today, and we're delighted that Charles from the New York Phil will be joining us later to the Q&A to talk a little bit about what they got from this study too. So the Audience Atlas study covers a few different areas. We asked a lot of questions about how people choose to spend their time, what kinds of art forms or activities they're interested in, how they decide what to do and see, what institutions or companies they might have heard of or engaged with. These are all things we cover as standard because we're trying to get a sense of the market. But this wasn't an ordinary year. So we also wanted to dig into some of the questions that had been coming up most often in conversations with our friends and clients over the past year, because as always, we want this to be as relevant and actionable as possible. So what we want to share today are the insights we gathered in trying to answer three questions we heard most often, the three issues that seem to be most pressing on the minds of cultural institutions. So these were, one, how can we reach a more diverse audience? Every organization we know is thinking about this right now. The will to do better, to connect with new people, to be more representative is there. How can we achieve it? Two, what is the future of digital? Digital content has evolved hugely over the last 18 months out of necessity. At this moment, we're so thrilled we can get back to in-person visiting and attending, but we don't want to throw away everything that we've achieved and learned on digital. So what happens now? And finally, how can we ensure sustainable financial support? It's been a tough year. Many organisations are facing significant financial pressures. How can we continue to survive and thrive and build support around us? Now, to manage expectations, I'd love it if we could say we could solve all 3 of these problems for you in the next hour. But of course, there is a reason they're on everyone's minds. There is no silver bullet. They are complicated and nuanced questions that we're going to be talking about for years. But anyone who knows MHM knows we're always thinking about actionable insights. So we hope that today we can provide you with some insights that you can take forward, whether that's something to reflect on and mull over yourself, or to take back to your organisations as evidence to fuel conversations and strategies, or something that helps you reaffirm your thinking and boost confidence in your planning, or even spark some new ideas. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to walk us through question 1. How do we reach a more diverse audience? And our summary for that was that art is universal, but maybe sometimes institutions are not. Let's dig in. So let me start with some fundamentals. Something we do a lot in our audience atlas studies is try to assess the size of the market for different types of cultural activities. For example, how many people are interested in dance? How many are open to trying classical music but haven't been yet? How many last went to a museum more than 5 years ago? And we might be able to tempt them back. And what we often find is that the market for each art form is larger than you might think. There's a lot of data on this slide, and we're more than happy to share the detail a bit later. There will be a full report released next week that you can take a closer look at. But essentially what we wanted to show is that for all of the art forms and activities tested, at least 60% of the adult population in New York is interested. The largest markets are at the top. So movies, zoos and aquariums and libraries, all over 90% in the market. Down at the bottom, we have things like opera or poetry and spoken word. They are the smallest markets, but still well over half the population are open to attending. And in New York, that's a huge number of people. And particularly for those on the lower half of the chart, other examples down there are like jazz or contemporary dance or even plays, there is much room to grow. The market overall is smaller, but the blue bar that's highlighted now shows the potential market, people who are open to attending, who want to try but haven't been persuaded yet. And anything under the dotted line has roughly 1 in 5 people or more in the potential market. So the market for different art forms is large and with room for growth, but the question we started with was about diversifying audiences. So let's get back to that. We started looking at all of this data through the lens of demographic characteristics. We mapped out the market for 6 different types of activities, comparing results by how people identified in terms of race or ethnicity or heritage background. The results are shown here, and as you'll see, there aren't many major differences for the 6 categories, and that's attractions like a zoo or aquarium or a garden, art museums, science museums, plays, or drama, classical music, and contemporary dance. The size of the market is very similar between different race or ethnicity groups. The bars are generally in a similar size within each activity. This is also true when we looked at it by age. And this isn't really surprising, because being old or young or white or black or Asian doesn't really make a difference to what you might be interested in. Lots of factors might determine what you've tried in the past, but at the heart of it, people are complicated and individual, and what they like is deeply personal. Having said all that, of course, that doesn't mean that inclusivity and diversity isn't an issue for the cultural sector. We all know that it is. So then we repeated the same process, looking at the data in terms of how people related to different cultural institutions. So not museums in general, but a specific museum. The starting point was awareness. What institutions are people even aware of as a place that they could go? The data on the slide shows a level of awareness of 6 specific but anonymized institutions matched to the 6 art forms we just saw. So there's an attraction, an art museum, a science museum, a theatre, a music organisation, and one for dance. Even on first glance, you can see it's quite a different picture than we saw in the last slide. Across all, those who identified as white had the highest level of awareness. In some cases, the difference is more stark than others. And for example, for museums and attractions, Asian identifying audiences have pretty high awareness in line with white audiences, but it seems to be less true for performing arts. But it's also worth noting that across all organisation types, Black or African American audiences and Hispanic or Latinx audiences have generally lower awareness. And so we just saw in the last slide that race or ethnicity doesn't impact on what types of activities or art forms people might be interested in. So this suggests the problem lies often at an institutional level, and awareness is the first hurdle. How can you persuade someone to visit if you aren't even on their radar? You can't connect with someone if you aren't reaching them. We need to seriously as a sector think about the messages we're putting out there and where we're putting them, because they aren't finding everyone equally. It's worth noting that the same is true by age. Across the board, most of the institutions saw much higher awareness as age increased. Now, of course, this does in part make sense. Older audiences have had more time living their lives and engaging with culture to get to know more organisations. Do we want to wait around for people to get older to get on their radar when we know that we could be forming lifelong relationships much earlier? I should note this wasn't completely universal. There were a few institutions that saw higher awareness for young people and people of colour, but it was very much the exception, not the rule. To dig into this idea of diversifying audiences more, we took another angle. We asked people what factors they consider in deciding what to do, what might contribute to choosing a specific performance or exhibition or institution. We'll start with the top three. The opportunity to try something new was the most common reason to choose to engage. There's definitely lots of potential to connect with new audiences. Just because someone hasn't engaged with you yet doesn't mean they don't want to. And we also all know the power of word of mouth. So it makes sense that friends and family having had good experiences is next, as is a place my whole family can enjoy. There's also several on the list that are worth thinking about in terms of who your audience is. Having a personal connection to the subject matter, feeling welcome in a space, somewhere I can meet with friends and socialise. These might be more complicated than they sound at first. Is your institution providing these for everyone equally, or just the people who are already coming? Do they mean the same thing to different groups? We also looked at these things through the lens of demographics again. We'll focus on younger audiences this time. There are some factors that increase in importance when we look at specifically at young people, as defined as under 35s in this case. Friends and family having had good experiences is key for younger audiences. And of course, this can become a cycle. If young people haven't heard of you and aren't visiting, they aren't telling their friends about it, who are quite likely also young people. But other factors that speak to something deeper are also more important for under 35s. So feeling welcome in a space, seeing people like me in the art, in the audience, and the staff and volunteers, and an organisation with a mission that aligns with my beliefs. These were all significantly higher of importance for those under 35. It's something to think about. Are you actively addressing and communicating these issues? What can you do on these to invite younger people in? So those are some fundamentals to think about in terms of how people decide where to go, but they likely aren't reasons to visit in and of themselves. There's still something much deeper, and that's the meaningful outcomes that we know cultural experiences can deliver. So we asked people what they were most looking forward to getting to when they could return to visiting cultural institutions. Quality time with family and friends, and fun, joy, and laughter came out on top. Interestingly, we asked a very similar question in a study in November last year in the Washington, DC area market, and the top answers were around doing something different or learning something new, which to us at the time made complete sense, as everyone had been stuck in their homes going a little stir crazy, so something different did seem essential. The change from that to quality time or fun is interesting to us. Now, of course, it's a different population. Maybe it's that the DC market thinks differently or happen to be more looking for new experiences. But I doubt that's the case. New Yorkers seem pretty adventurous to me and looking for new things. Instead, we think it's general shift in the 6 months between these studies. Now that we're finally getting back out, what we're looking for is joy and human connection. The other interesting thing here is that when we look at this question, by different age groups or race or ethnicity groups, there aren't many significant differences. These are more universal truths. And of course they are. I'm aware I'm stating the obvious here. There's no demographic groups that's going to be averse to joy and laughter. But it's also worth noting that lots of people picked lots of different outcomes when they were looking forward to, from social, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. People want a lot of different things from experiences that you can offer. Imagination, learning, and hope were all chosen. So the question is, how do we create meaningful messaging for diverse audiences when they want so many things? So I know some of you will be very familiar with culture segments already, but for those who are not, culture segments is our universal sector-specific psychographic segmentation system. The principal objective of culture segments is to really understand audiences and what motivates them, with a view to targeting them more accurately, engaging more deeply, and building relationships to maximize loyalty. Each segment is defined by what it is they seek when they engage with culture. We have identified 8 segments in the market. And we're not trying to suggest there's only 8 kinds of people in the world. This is a pragmatic way of grouping based on shared needs. Every kind of demographic group is included in each of the segments. So whatever ways you want to grow or diversify your audience, Cauldron segments can help. You just need to identify the segments that have the greatest opportunity for you. We'll come back to this idea later after a quick introduction to the key segments for the New York market. So I'll give a quick overview of the 5 segments that are the most interesting, we think, for the New York market. Expression are a third of the market, so we'll start with them. Expression are, we call people. Their cultural activity reflects their wide range of interests. They are in tune with their creative side, fun-loving, and they see culture as a way of broadening horizons. Culture is important in their lives and they want to share that with others. It's all about forming personal human connections with artists, with other audiences, even with people in their stories and history. They prize shared experiences and inclusivity. They want everyone to feel welcome and able to join in together. But it's not just a social experience. They're looking for something deeper, an emotional connection. They're often well networked and tend to bring people together. They thrive as part of a community and they can be generous with their time. And they want to see you as an organization being generous and welcoming and open to everyone too. They want to connect on a human level, not just see you as an authoritative distant institution. Release are the next largest at 16% of the market. And this is actually larger than we've seen in a lot of other US markets. So they're worth thinking about. Release is a segment who feel they just don't have enough time on their hands. They can sometimes feel under siege from all the demands on them. They feel like they never have quite enough time to able to engage with as much culture as they'd like to, and maybe don't understand how others quite manage it. With the sheer volume of cultural activities on offer in New York, it does make sense to me that release are a larger segment. It's perhaps easy to get overwhelmed by everything that you could be doing. But when release do engage, it's about escapism, to take a break from everyday stress and experience something amazing or relaxing or must see. It needs to be something absolutely worth their time. So we need to be really clear it's not to be missed and be explicit about what they'll gain from the experience. And also if we can create a sense of urgency to inspire them into acting. If it seems like they can put it off, they might well do. To attract release, think about making it as easy as possible for them, taking the hassle out of organizing. If they can book a ticket and a meal in one go, then great. The affirmation segment are next at 15% of the market in New York. Affirmation are perhaps the most conscientious of segments, can say. They are make considered and measured choices. What sometimes marks affirmation out from other segments is that as adults, they are likely to have made a conscious decision to embrace more of culture because they see it as the right thing to do. They want to get maximum value from the experience, learning something, bettering themselves in some way. Because it's all about doing something worthwhile. Affirmation want to make memories and enrich themselves. And they also might quite like the idea of being seen as someone who does cultural activities because it is worthwhile. They are open to new experiences, but they do need reassurance that they are welcome, like to have all the right information before getting into something. They like to be prepared. They will do their research and read reviews and plan ahead. But if you get it right for affirmation, they can be really loyal. I'll next talk about stimulation, 10% of the market. Stimulation is a segment who are all about the big idea. They are an active group who love adventure and live for the moment. They seek out new experiences to live a varied life. Do something different is what it's all about. This isn't just about gimmicks, so they're intellectually driven. They want a curious idea or new way of thinking or fascinating hook, something to really engage with, maybe something unexpected. They're independent minded, but they are aware of how they're perceived by others. They really like to be ahead of the curve and maybe also to be seen to be ahead of the curve. They don't shy away from mainstream activity, but they do like to be the ones making the discovery first and to tell others about it so they can be great for word of mouth. You do need to catch their attention though. They like to keep their options open. And finally, Essence. While they're small in the market at 7%, they are worth mentioning because I'm certain they will account for a higher portion of your visitors or ticket buyers. Essence consider the arts and culture essential. It's a way of exploring the world, reflecting on meaning and providing deeply emotional connections. Their main concern is quality. They've been to lots of places, they know what they like, they are discerning and confident. They will experience art and culture with or without others. It's all about the connection between them and the art. The opinions of others are often irrelevant. I'm in the Essence segment, so I'm speaking from experience here. For this reason, Essence often don't think they need marketing. They think it's for other people. They feel confident they can make up their own mind without you telling them what to think. They just need to know when it's where it's happening and when, and if they're interested, they'll be there. So we've done the summaries there. This chart on the slide shows a breakdown of culture segment profiles in the New York metro area by different race or ethnicity groupings. There are some differences, of course. Some segments have larger or smaller in each group. For example, it's interesting that the release segment in New York is more prominent in every ethnicity group other than white. Enrichment and simulation both fluctuate up and down a bit between groups, but every segment does exist in every group, and the same is true for age. We'll look next at what we can explore, how explore this in terms of the relationship with institutions. We saw earlier that when it comes to reaching younger and more diverse audiences, awareness is the first hurdle, getting on the radar of different people and then you're currently reaching. And part of that is likely channel, where are you placing comms and who is it reaching? But it's also about resonance. What's the message that can cut through the noise? Trying to design a message that will speak to young people will likely ring false. And of course, it's problematic to do the same for most demographic groups. So this is where psychographics can help. What segments should you be targeting to increase awareness? What segments are the young people who are not aware of us most likely to be in? We'll go through a short example looking at a specific institution. This chart is for one, a well-known but anonymized New York institution. It shows the proportion of 4 different segments in each of their distinct markets. The current market, the lapsed market, people who visited but more than 3 years ago, the potential market, rejectors who are not interested, and the unaware. Let's take a closer look. Starting with expression and working from left to right, expression represents 43% of the current market. So it's clear this organization has something that resonates with expression. They are almost half of the people who have visited in the past 3 years. Expression is a bit smaller in the lapsed and potential markets, but still prominent. There was room for growth. Expression are only 5% of the rejectors. Again, this gives a really good sign they were a good fit for this brand. They are very unlikely to say, I'm aware, but I'm not interested. But unaware is particularly interesting. It's the second highest. This tells us when expression know about this organization, they really respond to it, but a lot of them just aren't aware. If they want to cut through the noise and make a brand new connection with people who don't know about them, expression messaging could be the way to do it. Different example, looking at Essence, we see across here looking left to right that Essence generally decreases the further away from the institution they get. Essence tend to be informed and engaged and knowledgeable. If they're interested, they've probably found out about you on their own already. For an awareness campaign, Essence is probably not a useful target. Then there's Release. They do the opposite to Essence and increase slowly as further from the institution we get. Remember, these are people who are time poor, so thinking about there is scope to grow if we can make it seem worth their time. There's potential to connect and grow with Release in the lapsed, potential and unaware markets. We saw earlier as well, remember that in New York, Release were more likely than other segments to be people of colour. And finally, let's look at entertainment just for a complete contrast. We haven't talked about them much yet. This is a segment who seek fun. Arts and culture aren't necessarily a priority for this group. We kind of look at the wider leisure things. So theme parks, sports, maybe going out for dinner, anything that's fun is what's on their radar. Art might come into that and culture might come into that. But when they do engage, it's usually for more mainstream, bigger activities, anything that'll feel entertaining and fun. And those deeper needs we see other segments trying to fulfill aren't really high on their list. So entertainment are very small in this institution's current market, less than 1%. So it could be tempting to think that there's room for growth, but they also account for almost half of their rejectors, telling us this isn't necessarily a good fit. They're also low in the unaware. This segment are generally aware, but they've made up their mind they're not interested. So an awareness campaign aimed at entertainment probably wouldn't have much impact. Now, of course, we could also add further layers to this kind of analysis to look specifically at the segment profile of young people in each of the markets or different racial or ethnicity groups. We have data for a number of institutions included in the survey. If you want to know more, just reach out. So what can we do with all this? Consider how and where you message and who it's designed for. Increasing awareness, not through large brand campaigns, but thinking smartly about reaching people you are not is essential. Think about your welcome to in every sense of the meaning. Feeling welcome in a space, seeing themselves represented is more important to people you might not be reaching. Bring a little joy. We all need it right now, and that is universal. But think about using culture segments messaging to really resonate and cut through the noise. We want to be for everyone, but trying to appeal to everyone all at once often doesn't work. Think about the segment that will have the most impact for you. I'm now going to hand over to Laura, who'll take you through questions 2 and 3.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lorna, as well. I'm going to be taking us through our thoughts on the next 2 big questions. So the next thing that we're often being asked is this. What's the future of digital? Now that things have reopened, there's a tension with resourcing in-person events versus the digital that's received so much of our time and attention over the last 18 months. Clearly, we can't predict the future. However, one thing we can say is that digital culture is here to stay. So let's start with looking back before we look ahead. How has the market engaged with digital so far? So 61% of the market has engaged with some kind of digital offer from cultural organisations. So you can see this in the overall bar at the top. Within that, live or recorded music performances have been the most popular. A quarter of the market have attended a music performance online, followed by live or recorded theatre, and that's 23%. And then dance followed after that. So performance generally seems to have been the most popular. Underneath, we've got educational resources for adults like courses, workshops, and we also have talks with artists, writers, or performance. Museums and exhibitions, the types of content that might be less people-focused, they're generally less popular. This makes sense as they're formats which are more challenging to translate into online experiences. What's interesting is there hasn't been huge crossover. So we've seen that the market for all different types of art forms is really high. People are interested in loads of different ways of spending their time, but on average, each person has engaged with just 2.1 types of content online. So a quarter accessed one type of content only, 16% tried two, and 1 in 5 ventured to 3 or more. So despite the huge wealth of types of content available over the last 18 months, audiences haven't been sampling it like an all-you-can-eat buffet. They've been pretty conservative in the number of different experiences that they've tried. If we look behind the overarching numbers, age does play a role in digital cultural consumption too. So this chart shows the youngest age groups on the left, moving through to those over 65 on the right. As you can see, younger audiences were significantly more likely to have engaged with culture digitally. With the 3 youngest age brackets, around 80% of them had engaged with digital culture in some form. You can see on the chart here that then it drops significantly for 45 to 54-year-olds, and then it continues to drop as age increases. But even though 84% of 18 to 24-year-olds have engaged with some form of digital content from cultural institutions, the crossover is still fairly low. Still only 21% have tried 3 or more different types of online culture. We can look at it by culture segment as well. So the good news for New York institutions is that the 4 largest segments in your market, plus Essence, have been the most active and engaging with digital by quite some way. Expression have been the most active. So you can see there 80% in the yellow have engaged with digital culture. You'll remember that they're the biggest segment in the market in New York, and they're the people as well. They're also the segment most likely to have tried multiple different types of digital culture. 33% have engaged with 3 or more types that we tested. Essence in the purple come next. We often find that Essence have been very active with digital, but it's fair to say they find it the least satisfying. For them, it's not a replacement for the real thing. It's been a passable substitute while institutions are closed. And then we've got stimulation, affirmation, and release, all on or above average in their digital consumption. Release have been the least adventurous in terms of trying different types of activity. Only 20% have done 2 or more types. This makes sense. They're time poor and they want to make it count. So we saw this just a moment ago. This is the proportion of the market who had engaged with digital cultural content. But what about future engagement? What are people interested in doing next? So this shows the previous chart, but with those interested in engaging in digital future added on the top. These are the extra people who haven't engaged yet, but they're keen to. So what we can see here is that the change isn't huge. 71% would engage in future in any digital content. So this is a 10 percentage point increase on those who've already engaged. So there is room for growth, but it isn't huge. Most of the people who would engage in some way with digital have already done so, which does make sense. So if there was ever a time to give it a try, it would have been the last 18 months. The number of different types of content also doesn't increase much. So 2.1 increases to 2.3. Again, age shows a similar pattern. Younger audiences are enthusiastic, older audiences tend to be less interested. So developing brand new audiences for culture might be challenging through digital, especially now in-person visits or events are available, but there is clearly still a strong continued appetite from those who've previously engaged. It's also possible that there's room for growth in digital outside of the local market, so somewhere that people have less access to as many institutions on their doorstep. Obviously, New Yorkers have so many options to go back to in person. So what we're seeing in general is a long-term interest in continued engagement with digital culture from those who've attended before. However, if you look at the top bar here below the key, which shows this statement, when venues first reopen, I want to take a break from digital content. Half the market agreed with this. So you can see that in the green. And over on the right, only 23% disagreed. In the DC study last November, we asked people if they wanted a break from screen time generally, and we definitely saw that screen fatigue showing there. So it does make sense that audiences might want to pause on digital to get back to in-person visiting for a while. But then if we look at the second bar chart, there is some appetite for hybrid experiences. So 41% agreed that they'd like experiences that combine digital and physical in the future. Those in the 25 to 34-year-old age group were most likely to be interested, and those over 65 were not. Expression were the segment most interested in hybrid experiences, but stimulation, who like adventure and novelty, and affirmation, who likes to get the most from an experience, were also more likely than average to agree. So the takeaway here is that in the short term, it's absolutely fine if you need to get back to refocusing on reopening or live events. This is likely to suit the audience as well. But do think creatively about how digital and in-person could be combined for something really unique. We're going to go on and talk about spend and financial support more in the next section, but of course that is part of the digital question too. So not just are people interested in digital, but what value do they place on it? Are they willing to pay for the content? Is it going to be worth our while to continue to invest in this type of content? And can it be ongoing as an income stream? So we saw earlier that 61% of the population had engaged with digital content in some form. And that splits pretty evenly between people who've paid for content and those who've only engaged with freely available content. So you can see that 29% of the market overall have paid for digital content. Younger audiences, as well as being more likely to have engaged with digital content generally, have also been much more likely to have paid for it. So it rises to 57% of 25 to 34-year-olds who've paid. Black or African American or Hispanic or Latinx audiences were also more likely than other race or ethnicity groups to have paid for content. If we look at it by culture segment, Essence, despite being highly active digitally, are less likely than the other segments to have paid for content. So this links to what I was saying earlier about them being less satisfied with digital and placing less value on it than the real life experience. Essence, not surprisingly, were the segment most likely to have paid for content. And what about the future? So 32% of the market said they're willing to pay for digital content in the future. This is just 3% more than the proportion who've paid in the past. But just 16% say they wouldn't pay for digital. So the remaining 23%, they're not sure. They're open to it. Perhaps they haven't been convinced yet of the value of digital content. And it's up to us to show them that it's worth it. Again, same story, expression, younger audiences are more willing to pay for digital in the future. This is the same pattern that we saw with those who've already paid. Interestingly, Essence show a greater willingness to pay for digital in the future than they've done in the past. So they're not ruling it out, but they need to be super confident that it was worth it. The last thing to look at on digital is not just would people pay, but how much. What specific value do they place on digital cultural content? So this chart shows how demand goes down as price goes up. This is obviously completely expected. The green line, which is the highest, represents music performances. People generally seem a little more willing to pay for music at most price brackets. The price people would say pay for theatre performances and exhibitions are quite similar. They're the blue and purple lines you can see. And then talks with artists or experts is generally a bit lower. In a bit more detail, we can look at the specific price sensitivity points. I appreciate this is a lot of information, so don't worry, you can analyze this chart in your own time. But for now, I'll tell you that for talks, which is the pink, we can see quite a substantial drop in interest as you charge more than around $10. At this point, you lose just over a third of the market. At over $15, you lose almost half the market. For music, you can afford to go a bit higher. So in the $15 to $19 bracket, you've still got most of the market in, that's almost 2/3. For online theatre performances and for exhibitions, you probably don't want to go over $20. At this $20 mark for all tested art forms, the price becomes intolerable for the majority, but not all of the market. So to summarize on digital, think about your long-term plans. Build an audience slowly, be sure it's worth the investment you're putting in, know your plan and know your strategy. Consider how digital could connect with younger audiences particularly. It might not be a way in for those new. Digital culture looks like a great way to deepen relationships with your institution or art form. Look to bring new and exciting experiences to those who are already on board with digital. And then enjoy getting back to in-person right now. People do still have a bit of screen fatigue. As you remember what Lorna was saying earlier, people are mainly looking for quality time with friends and family right now. And this is something that digital will struggle to provide. And then explore combining digital and physical events or experiences. The second most sought outcome from earlier that people want from culture in general was fun and joy and laughter. This is absolutely something digital can provide, and hybrid experiences will be well placed for this as well. And then finally, communicate the benefits. Make the case to audiences for why it's worth spending, but this also goes for internally too. If you want to provide free digital culture, make sure you know and can clearly communicate to the wider team why you're doing it. So our final question is, how can we ensure sustainable financial support? So the very short answer to this is not to treat diversity and financial sustainability like they're two different things. Building diverse communities, it's hugely important for the future of the sector. So we're going to start with looking at general spend on cultural institutions. We asked about spend on cultural activity in a normal year pre-pandemic, just to get a sense of where we're starting from. Because of course, buying tickets or paying for admission is a key source of information, and it's a way that audiences often see themselves as supporting institutions. It's important to note in the data that trips to the movies are not included here. So we saw a range of responses, as you would expect. If we look at it in $50 bands, the largest proportion of people, 25%, spend less than $50. Just less than 1 in 5 spend $50 to $100. And then about the same again, spend $100 to $150. And this is per year. There's quite a drop at this point, all the way up to $300. But then there's an uptick to 13% for those who spend more than $300 per year. This will partly be because the band is clearly more than a $50 range. It's anything over $300. But it does also show the potential at the top end of the range. It's useful to think about this in terms of the vast range of cultural activity there is available in New York. Again, we saw earlier that people are interested in lots of different types of art forms and experiences, but they're obviously being quite discerning about what they actually do. Almost half the market spend less than $100 per year. That's not a huge number of trips. We looked at spend by different demographic factors. So older audiences tended to spend more than younger audiences. People with higher income levels and high levels of education tended to spend more, not a surprise. And there were some patterns by race or ethnicity too. So white identifying audiences spent more than any other race or ethnicity group. Black or African American audiences and Hispanic or Latinx audiences were the least likely group to spend over $100 per year on cultural institutions. But we also asked about the future. Post-pandemic, how do people imagine their spending on culture habits will change? Here, Black and African American audiences and Hispanic or Latinx audiences were the more likely than average to say that they would like to or plan to spend more on cultural activities in the future. So there's a clear opportunity to form relationships with more diverse audiences to increase attendance and increase spend. So diversifying audiences isn't just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do in terms of long-term sustainability. We looked at donations. 35% of the New York culture market say that they have donated to a museum, theatre, or other cultural institution. 43% reported that they've been a member of a cultural institution or attraction. We excluded public libraries here as we wanted to focus on organisations that had mostly paid memberships. What's really interesting is that we saw some opposing trends for donating versus cultural spend. So income remained the same. Those with a higher level of income more likely to have made a donation than those earning under $75,000. But younger audiences were more likely than older audiences to say that they had made a donation in the last 3 years. You'll remember that older audiences tended to spend more. And white audiences were less likely than every other race or ethnicity group to have donated. Those who identified as Black or African American were the most likely to have made a donation. We should state we didn't ask about value. I'm very aware that if many of you profiled your high-level donor list, they'd likely be older and white. But we can see here the opportunity to diversify the supporter base is absolutely there. We saw right at the beginning of the session that awareness was low among younger audiences and audiences who identified as any race or ethnicity other than white. So imagine how many supporters you could reach if they knew about you. Of course, it will take work. There's the supporter journey to go through first, from visitor to member and so on, but it's absolutely worth the investment. We asked people why they chose to support cultural organisations in their own words. We had a range of responses that often boiled down to this, which is lovely and so telling, but we wanted to dig deeper. So we also asked some specific quantitative questions on reasons for donating as well. You can see there are a range of reasons, from altruistic to supportive. The top 3 reasons are fairly fundamental. So helping to keep artists and staff employed, that's obviously been pretty top of mind over the last year or so. Supporting somewhere in my community and supporting a place I visit often, these make sense. I would encourage everyone to think flexibly about the word community. It can mean more than somewhere just local, as you know. It can also mean somewhere that you feel an affiliation to. By segment, expression more likely to choose all of the options, and release more likely to choose none of the options. But if we look at this by age, we do see some interesting patterns, which is really useful to think about when it comes to the future. What does the next generation of donors look like? The top 3 reasons that we looked at just now were fairly consistent across age brackets. But if we look at 2 very specific age categories, so that's 25 to 34 and 65 plus, we see some of the more stark differences in the remaining segments. So these 4 are a little more personal, suggesting stronger relationships. So these are supporting a mission that aligns with my beliefs, seeing what my organisation can do, gaining benefits and access, and also sharing the work with others. All of these were more important to that younger age group than the older one. They're not necessarily altruistic, but they are all around active involvement. So being a part of it, but also sharing their world with others. One thing we've seen for a few years now with younger audiences is the desire to support bigger causes, climate or politics or social justice. And in the past 2 years, this has increased even further. It's hard for culture to compete with this in terms of need. So we need to work hard to make a connection and show how we fit in to the bigger picture. The other thing we wanted to try and understand was how people had responded to the pandemic in terms of membership. Through conversations with clients, we've heard lots of different stories. Some have understandably seen a decline in memberships because they weren't able to offer the access and the benefits that they normally provided, but others found membership had actually held steady, and in some cases they'd even seen a surge of support from their communities. This bore out in the data as well, so we got a pretty even split, with a third citing that they let memberships expire and another third having renewed anyway, even while an institution was closed. I should say that these aren't mutually exclusive. One individual could have done both with different institutions, and obviously there were other options as well. So in some cases, memberships were put on pause, or where institutions chose to extend memberships that they didn't have to. We wanted to understand specifically what influenced these decisions. We asked people to think of one organisation for which they'd chosen to continue their membership throughout the pandemic, even if the institution was closed to the public. People responded with a wealth of lovely comments about different organisations. We've included some here, and I'll just pause to let you have a quick read through them. So we also wanted to know what it was that helped them make that decision, that had encouraged them to continue their support when they might not have access to their usual benefits. This lovely quote summed up a lot of feeling. They understand the value of art and the impact it has on the world. But what more can we learn about people's responses in the last 18 months about how to build long-term, sustainable, enduring support, to build relationships with supporters that aren't dependent on transactions? So when we dug a bit further, there were 3 general themes that emerged. Number 1 was that they still needed me. There was an understanding of how things work, that an organisation being closed doesn't mean a break in costs, bills still need to be paid. The Bronx Zoo, I don't know if anyone from the zoo is on the webinar, was actually one of the organisations cited most often in this category. Perhaps the need to care for animals is easier to understand than the ongoing costs of a museum or a theatre. It's a face on the cost that people can connect to, a cute face they want to care for. But it does show the value in building that knowledge amongst your supporters about how their funds are used and how crucial their support is. The second reason was this: it's considered a lifelong relationship. So people said things like, I've been a member forever, this was just a blip, I wouldn't have dreamed of stopping. We appreciate this one is perhaps less within your immediate control. But the final one is particularly interesting. It's much more about an emotional connection, a feeling of belonging, and surely this is something that we can all work on, building a community that helps people feel like they belong, and giving people something to align to and to feel a part of. So to summarize on financial support, invest in diversifying audiences. Aside from anything else, it's good business in the long run. Think about how to reach the next generation of supporters. And do this by connecting to issues bigger than ourselves, the things that are on people's minds already. And then focus on building belonging among membership. I'm going to pass back to Lorna at this point.
Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to wrap up now and we're going to Q&A. So just a summary here of what we've been talking about. I won't spend too long on it because I'm aware of time. So how do you reach a more diverse audience? Well, what we summarise that as is art and culture is universal, but institutions are not. Awareness is the first hurdle. Consider how and where you message and how you can find new people in the most effective, targeted way. Think about your welcome in every sense of the meaning. What are all the signs that might show someone that they are welcome or not? Bring a little joy, we all need it right now, and use culture segments to really cut through the noise, how your message can resonate. What's future digital? Well, we think it's here to stay, but we need to cultivate an audience for it. Think about long-term plans for digital, be certain it's worth your time and investment and what you want to gain from it. Consider how it can connect to new younger audiences, but it might not be a way in, it can be more about deepening relationships. Enjoy getting back to in-person now, your audience are doing the same. And lastly, communicate the benefits. What will audiences gain to make it worth them spending? And of course, finally, how can we ensure sustainable financial support? Diversity and sustainability go together. We need to create community. So invest in diversifying audiences. It's worth it both to be inclusive and for financial long-term return. Think about how to reach the next generation of supporters. They might be motivated by different things, and engage with the relevant big issues and focus on building belonging amongst your membership. So that's all we have to share today on what's next for New York audiences. We want to just finish with saying what's next for us. So we have a full report with all of this data that we've shared today. It's set for release next week. We'll send it direct to anyone who signed up for the webinar. So it's going to come to your inbox, no action needed, and you can dig into all the data you want to. We also do have specific data on 51 New York institutions we included in the survey. This means for these institutions, we can size the market, look at who is visited and who hasn't, who might in the future by demographics and culture segment. We can look at any of the questions we asked across motivations, marketing, media, and decision-making through the lens of your different markets as well. If you want to know if you're one of those institutions and find out more about the data, please do just reach out. We're really happy to talk to anyone through what we've collected. So that's it, thank you. Our emails are on this slide there, and they should hopefully go in the chat as well. And we would love to hear any questions you have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second, and our colleague Charlene is going to join us, a new member of the MHM team. But we're also thrilled to have a special guest. Charles from the New York Philharmonic is also here, and we're going to start the Q&A by asking him a couple of questions about the work we did together. Okay, so we've got Charlene there. Hi, and Charles as well. Hi there. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves first of all? Charles, do you want to go first since I can see you there?
Yeah, sure. Hi, it's good to be with everyone today. I'm Charles Buchanan. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Director of Growth Marketing at the New York Philharmonic. And I just want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Chris Tedrick, who was a big part of our project with MHM. He's also on the call today.
Charlene, do you want to say hi? Before we get started?
Hi, I'm Charlene Chu. I'm very new to MHM, but I've worked with them for years. I'm a senior consultant. You've probably seen me before. I was formerly with Brooklyn Academy of Music. Very happy to be with the MHM family.
Thank you. Charles, I wonder if we could start by asking you a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I'd love to hear if you could talk about a little bit about we partnered for this study, like what you're hoping for to gain from it, like why you chose to partner with us for this project.
Yeah, sure. Well, so first of all, my MHM culture segment is stimulation, and I took that quiz about a decade ago now, and so I've definitely found over the years like that's for sure who I am and the type of marketing that speaks to me and the types of events that I go to. So yeah, at the New York Philharmonic, when we were closed for the pandemic, we used some of that time to really just like bring up to speed some of our research and look at things that we were doing. And one of the things we've always done really well to have an understanding of our audience is really like analyzing all the transactional data and the behavioral data associated with that, like recency. And we do a lot of looking at frequency across all of our different like buyer segments. And then we do a lot looking at the genre of the programming that people attend. And the one thing we wanted a better understanding of is like more of a layer on top of that, at what motivates people to engage with us, to come to a concert, to come as little or as much as they do. And really just their attitude and mindset about classical music, about us as an institution. So we partnered with MHM on a project that was sort of three-pronged, starting with a really in-depth survey, and then we did focus groups, and then we were partners on the audience atlas for the New York City population. And the main thing we really wanted to do is just come out of that, like understanding more about like our audience views toward us. And with the New York City population, like really what is the awareness of us and of classical music? What is our like prospective audience that we can be going for, especially coming out of the pandemic? But on top of that, at the Philharmonic, we're going to be launching our new concert hall, which is under a major construction project right now. And with that, launching a new brand. So we wanted to just be really well equipped to like understand who our audience is and who else we could be going for to expose our programs to. So that was basically like why we did the project. And did you ask, was there another part of the question?
Well, I guess my next one would be like, how's it been going so far? Like, what have you been doing with it? Like, is there anything you want to share in terms of what's come out of the project?
Yeah, sure. Well, so we finished, it was probably about 6 months ago, maybe less. It was over the summer, this project. And I think one of the first things that was really, I think, eye-opening was sort of like an education of the marketing team. For anyone who's familiar with these segments, like you realize a lot about culture segments is how you communicate to people, and that every person, how they engage with culture is different. So typically what happens is a marketing person will write to themselves, like they'll create copy to themselves, they'll pick visuals that appeal to them. So it's just like that education. It seems simple, but it's not. Like, so a lot of the first part was really just like building the awareness within our team of like, if we write one version of copy, who are we actually talking to? Because it's not everyone. And so it started with that. And then I think the main things we've done so far has just been testing out different types of communication. So thinking more about like, who are the segments we're looking at, and trying more than one version of our assets and copy to speak to those people. And that's been mostly digitally, so over email. And then the other thing that we're looking at doing is really like expanding this knowledge out across other teams, because in marketing, we really get it now. Most of our team knows what segment they are, and they're aware of that. And but we want to like bring in more teams like PR and our customer service and even artistic to really understand culture segments and how what they do can play a role in that. So
yeah, have it as a shared language, I guess, between the two. Great, we have a few minutes left. Charlene, are there any questions coming in the Q&A or anything you want to?
Yeah, we got two great ones from Jen from Silver Linnet. She writes, I'm curious about how people interpret the combined digital and physical offerings question. Would that be an experience that is in person with add-on pre-post offerings? Would it be the option to consume either through digital or in-person content, something else? I believe it was fairly open, so it could be interpreted as both. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It could be interpreted both. I think people interpret different ways. I think it's about a chance to get creative and look at different things. I did as we were coming out of the kind of lockdown phase, I did one of those things where you sort of follow a trail on your phone. So it's a combination of the digital, but it also lets you get back in person as well. So yeah, anything for that chance to be more just different and unexpected.
Cool. And then the second one, also from Jen, it would be great to have you speak directly to why you believe digital is here to stay. As another data point in the Culture and Community National Study, Silver Linnet and Culture Track found that 2/3 of Americans expect to choose in-person events rather than online activities when they can safely attend in-person programming. We're thinking about it a lot. We are too. And what that means for the future of digital consumption in arts and culture. And I think, Laura, you've spoke to that. So if you want to add anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so our data has shown that people who have engaged in the past are absolutely keen to keep doing that. And sometimes it's not as easy as, something being there on your doorstep or, attending it on your phone or on your computer. So what our data found was that lots of people who have engaged in the past are definitely interested in doing it again in the future. But it will be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years. Obviously, people have expressed that kind of screen fatigue. So how that then kind of changes as we enter new phases of hopefully post-pandemic, what that looks like it will be really interesting to see. But absolutely, that's our analysis of it, that we think that digital isn't going anywhere. Anything to add, Lorna?
Great.
Okay, and the last question came from Tom Brown, who I think has just left, but I have answered it. But in case I missed any regions that we covered, do we cover any other markets aside from New York?
Yeah, we have done these studies for multiple different markets. This one is focused on New York, but we had one for DC earlier, and we've done them in the past in Boston and San Francisco as well, and other countries too. Great.
And that's
okay.
it.
Brilliant. I think that's us then. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much, Charles, for being a special guest as well. And yeah, if anyone would like to hear more or has any follow-up questions, please do reach out. We're really happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.